So we're at infantry.
Army infantry at the time, to give everyone the same reference, was formed of 10 companies. Each company, in theory, was 100 strong, giving a total strength of 1,000. This was very rare to actually be brought up to full strength, and typically about a third of the men, but it would fluctuate wildly, would be off sick. At any one time in the peninsula, sickness caused more deaths and wounded than actually battlefield fighting. The strongest regiments could be up to just over 1,000 if they've just been recently replenished, but actually the weakest would be down to around 500. So it caused a huge amount of devastation in the era. There were 8 centre companies, they were known as, and then 2 flank companies, one of grenadiers and one of light infantry. The light company typically being swifter and faster and more intelligent and trained to fight in pairs, whereas the grenadiers were meant to be stronger and taller. This didn't always work out, but certainly there was a new emergence in light infantry doctrine, which started off in the south coast of Britain, imported basically from the Germans and emigres who trained up the British Army very well. But it was a new idea that's slowly coming in. Yep. Next slide, please, Tom. I'm going to bounce through these quite quickly. The artillery, both the field artillery and the Royal Horse Artillery would have 6 guns in either a battery or a company. They had 2 types, normally a 6 or 9 pounder gun and a howitzer. Next slide, please. The howitzer, these very quickly, these were provided very nicely, this drawing from Land of History. Josh Proven drew these for us. They would have 5 pounder guns and 1 howitzer, typically a 5.5 inch, which is the size of the projectile they'll be firing. This would lob a shell through the air, cut the fuse right, it would explode overhead on the downward arc, basically making a sphere of canister shots raining down upon the enemy where they can't do anything about it. Even in cover, it can fire down, causing terrible casualties, especially on densely packed ranks. The 6 or 9 pounder guns, again, the size of the projectile, could fire a lot further, probably over 1,000 yards. And what they're trying to do is skim the rounds to go in front of the enemy and basically bowl them over. I always think of it like bowling a cricket ball at the crease, and they're trying to skim and bounce. You actually want to get them on the first or second bounce. In packed masses and in pitched battles, these would typically do the most damage, accounting for well over 50% of the deaths in a battle we'd see at Waterloo or something like that kind of pitched battle. But Porto was a bit different. And then the third branch of the fighting would be the cavalry. Do the next slide. Organized along similar lines. Rather than having companies, they would have troops led by a captain. In theory, at the beginning, they would have 100 men and mounts. This had already been reduced to just 80 per troop, giving a total of 800 in a regiment, again, organized into 10 troops. But they were very much struggling with both recruitment of the men and training of the horses. And remounts was a particular problem when out on campaign. So they'd normally form themselves into squadrons. That would be 2 troops under the senior captain. And then a regiment would send anywhere between 2 to about 6 squadrons out. So it would normally be 2 or 4 actually would go out with a squadron on British duties and a squadron on retraining and recruitment in the UK, and others as spares. So they wouldn't really fought normally as a full regiment, and then they could be detached as smaller brigades. The cavalry, even though Porto was typically city fighting, did play a crucial part. And that brings us on to just the background of it, along with the Portuguese. The Portuguese, really interestingly, had been invaded, is what we're going to come on to, and their army was really divided. The Napoleonic French army had taken a huge contingent, the majority of them that they hadn't disbanded, formed them into a corps called the Portuguese Legion, and marched them across Spain to form them into the French army. They actually ended up fighting as far away as Russia during the 1812 campaign in the invasion, and suffered huge casualties there. But many of them knew that they were going to be fighting for a war they didn't believe in. And they were also strongly motivated men to fight for their home country, which has been invaded. I'm always quite almost like proud to think that actually 50% of them deserted before they left Portugal and Spain and rejoined the Portuguese army. The men you see there are the loyal Lusitanian Legion, well, the center and right-hand man are in green and gray. And that was to differentiate them between the Portuguese Legion. They were the loyal Lusitanian Legion, which were mostly led by British officers, and from the Portuguese who managed to escape to Britain, they were reformed, retrained, and sent back into Portugal whilst they were waiting for the main Portuguese army to really re-establish itself, which they did very successfully. The Portuguese were very highly thought of. Now, the British were very normally skeptical of the emigre regiments and the foreign forces within the British ranks. It's a very sad British tradition that they're very skeptical, almost suspicious of anybody else who's not one of their own. But the Portuguese proved themselves time and time again, very quickly on, largely through their motivation to expel a foreign invader. Which brings us on to the next slide, please. So this is 1812, but it gives you an idea of the reach of the Napoleonic Empire at this time. Just to give you some background, Napoleon's master of most of Europe by 1807, 1808, and he's looking to expand his influence into the satellite states as much as he can. He is an ally of Spain, who were, if you imagine, fighting with the French only in 1805 at Trafalgar against Admiral Nelson's fleet. He wants to expand his influence to the southern flank because that's bordering the home nation, whereas to the east he's got far more satellite regions, and anywhere he can he'll put one of his marshals, one of his generals, or even a member of his family onto the newly conquered thrones. And he does this time and time again, where he can't take control himself, and then he can kind of have them as puppet client kingdoms. Spain was very different. It had an established Bourbon monarchy, and they were signed up as being allies. Portugal was not the same. Portugal was staying neutral as far as it can, but it continued a really strong series of trade with the United Kingdom. This actually trade and military alliance actually dates back to the late 1400s. It's a really strong alliance where Britain and Portugal had signed up together, largely based on our love of the port and the wine and the other produce coming from the nation. Napoleon realized that the only way to literally strangle Britain into surrender would be to do that through economic means, as invasion was highly unlikely, both before Trafalgar really, but especially afterwards. Trafalgar took the invasion efforts completely off the table. So an economic blockade was set up called the Continental System, and it was an idea effectively to block any ideas of trade, and everybody had to sign up to this or face the consequences. Portugal did not. They had no reason to. They were an independent sovereign nation, and they continued the trade. They faced a threat, and they actually eventually capitulated. The threat was to actually not only break off the trade, but to go so far as to declare war on Britain. The French, mostly under Marshal Junot, marched into Portugal in 1806 and 1807. And by 1807, they had occupied all of Portugal without firing a shot. And this is really where Britain comes into. It's the Portuguese who effectively come cap in hand to London and asked for an expeditionary force to be sent out. And that was done under a relatively young General Sir Arthur Wellesley, who was actually very quickly replaced. But we'll cover those, I think, in the next slides. We've got, and we've got Spain as well. It throws me by not clicking through my own slides. So whilst France was in Portugal, they actually also then decided to turn around and take a moment of opportunity to capture Spain as well, their ally. Napoleon summoned the king and the Prince Regent of Spain to France. They had actually decided to do a quick civil war to actually swap their roles and have the prince as the new crowned head. But by the time they reached France, the population of Spain were no longer happy. They'd heard rumors that the princesses and the children of the royal family were going to be taken away back to France as well, where they're going to be effectively kept under house arrest. And the population of Spain were very afraid of the French Revolution, which for all of its liberal ideas was crushing down on the church, which has a much stronger influence in Spain than it did currently in both French and British culture. And they were very worried about what it would mean for their regime. This led to a clash, mostly in Madrid. And the clash was against French cavalry under Murat. It was famous here. This is a painting by Francesco Goya, a beautiful painting of a devastating scene where the local population attacked Napoleon's Mamelukes, one of the kind of famed bodyguard almost of Napoleon. And it led to huge reprisal killings where the French then would go wantonly destruction to try to suppress the revolution. But it's very hard to criticize the Spanish and the Portuguese too heavily because they had effectively been invaded, but it was a catalyst to start the war. They were now known as heroes of this war of independence, or a patriotic war to liberate themselves, independence or liberation, depending on the translation, in Spain and Portugal. And this was really the beginning where people actually armed themselves from the local armories and fought to the death that day, the Dos de Mayo killings by Goya. And that starts to lay the siege. So next slide. For a bit of more context, I was saying earlier about the British sickness, but the French suffered really heavily. And leading on from the Dos de Mayo, it really started the idea of the guerrilla war. It's actually where we get the name from, guerrillas being war, guerrilla being like little war. So it was the constant fighting of both the Spanish and the Portuguese population, men and women, taking arms up. And it was a horrendous war. And I will read one of the accounts later of both sides and the consequences of these against the normal population. But between 1808 and 1814, the French roughly, and it's very hard to estimate the full estimates here, but around 240,000 killed in Spain in that time. Basically, half of that is from sickness and illness. It's a huge country, and it would also include starvation within that. Something that happened later on is Wellington built the lines of Torres Vedras and starved Massina's army out of Portugal. The guerrilla war, as you can see, I mean, it's pretty accurate as estimates going, but we'll never know the full extent because they were fighting literally in the hills. 76,000, leaving the battles as 45,000. So actually the smallest contribution of the warfare actually being pitched fighting. So it gives a bit of context to how difficult it was for the French in that time to hold it all down. Okay, next, please. The Peninsular War really begins in 1807. By the time that we reach it, Wellington's got a relatively small army based around Lisbon. He's been given a relatively small expeditionary force, knowing that he will be replaced. Now, the war rages on until 1814 and eventually actually reaches all the way up through the Pyrenees with very fierce fighting into the Pyrenees and beyond. But during that time, it's one of the most complicated wars of the era because it does actually flip between Portugal, Spain. They liberate Madrid in 1812 and then have to evacuate it very soon afterwards. It moves around many times with separate places like Zaragoza and Valencia on the east. Cadiz never actually hands over and they hold out as a stronghold in the south. And during all this time, you've got the guerrilla warfares as well as them. The Spanish army, which is quite scattered, but does continue to fight on and wins the odd success as well. So to give the overall idea that this is a huge country, and it's known normally now as the Spanish ulcer, which bled the French army dry of so many men. And just for the right-hand side, just some of my favorite paintings of the patrol of the hussars in the deep snow in Spain, and at the bottom, the Battle of Vitoria of British going into the town and fierce street fighting, which is something I'm going to come on to in a moment. So next, please. So in 1807, so Arthur Wellesley, as he then is, is leading his force. So Arthur Wellesley does go on to become the great Duke of Wellington, and he's leading his army, and he actually goes on the offensive. This is one of the things that I'm very clear to stress is Wellington's often labelled a defensive general, and this isn't really the case in either strategy or in tactics, and he goes on the attack many times. In Roliça, he attacks a town around a windmill, and the French actually withdraw. And they withdraw up very steep escarpments, actually led by their Swiss, who tried to surrender to the British to actually fight on their side. And the British fight up these steep cliffs very quickly with deep casualties to certain regiments and hand-to-hand fighting where they can. Colonel Lake, who leads the charge, is killed, and they manage to push the French off the battlefield, which leads to them being reinforced at Vimeiro, right on the coast, just north of Lisbon. There's a Allied landing, and a lot of reinforcements come in. It's at this point that they are attacked. I wrote an article on it called "They Came On in the Same Old Way for the First Time," and this is where the British learned really that they 2 lines deep, just on the reverse slope of the hill, and how deadly that could be against French columns. They fought very successfully, and Wellington was replaced actually on the evening of Vimeiro. He was meant to be replaced before the fight started, but the next commander knew it was wise to let him carry it out. And as he went to go on to pursue, he was replaced, and then his commander in turn was replaced. So you have, in 2 days, basically 3 replacements. This leads to a really difficult situation where the treaty is then signed between the French and the British with very different aims. And I strongly believe that Wellington would have liked to carry on and fight. And it's known as the Treaty of Sintra, or the Convention of Sintra. And they give far too generous terms to the French. Not only do they agree that they can keep all their arms and swords, they can keep their colours, they can actually keep the loot that they've taken from Portugal, which is quite an offence to the Portuguese. But to kind of put the nail in the coffin, they agree that the Royal Navy is going to transport them back to France. So they effectively get a taxi journey home with all the loot and no negatives to their campaign, other than having to withdraw from Portugal itself. But they are then basically free to start the war all over again. So Wellington, Wellesley as he was, and the other commanders are withdrawn back to Britain. I think that'll bring us on to the next slide. They were drawn back to Britain, and they are effectively investigated for their parts. All 3 of the commanders, including Wellesley, are admonished of their behaviour, but the other 2 are moved into sideways roles. And I'll know more part of the story. Whereas Wellesley is actually very quickly brought back to Portugal. During this time, the 2 commanders, mostly under Sir John Moore, now pick up the campaign. Poor Sir John Moore, who helped in a somewhat bureaucratic way to reform the British light infantry, is promised a lot of support by the Spanish. So against most advice, he marches into Spain to hopefully join up with the Spanish, which the support never comes. And around Salamanca, a city that comes to fame later for the Peninsular War, but deep inside Spain, he receives words just before Christmas that the French forces that he thought was then going to be invading Portugal to the south has turned tail. The man who intercepts these dispatches is a captain, Captain John Winters, an intelligence officer. He plays a large part in Porto later on. He brings the words to John Moore that there's a huge corps from 3 different sides converging upon him. And one of them is going to be led by Napoleon himself, who's briefly ventured down into Spain. This leads to the famous retreat to Corunna, one of Britain's darkest but most famous hours, where the army marches through the deep winter all the way northwest, with separate branches going both west and south to try to use different roads, with famous rearguard actions normally commanded by Lord Paget, Uxbridge as he becomes, in cavalry actions such as Sahagun, or here this painting held at the Royal Green Jackets Museum in Winchester of the 95th Rifles turning tail and fighting. The most famous of these cases being Rifleman Plunkett, who shoots French targets at a disputed but around 300 yards distance. And the army do make most of their way back after Sintra, after Corunna, back to Britain, where unfortunately on the retreats they've had to kill most of their mounts. There's not room for their horses on board the Royal Navy vessels, and the men are in such a ragtag way. Many of them, when they arrive at Plymouth on the southwest coast, it's the first time that the British population have seen a defeated British army coming back. And it's really noted about their state. They are basically described as beggars. One of the men who helps organize them and actually get them through Plymouth, which is going to be a bit of a feat because the men are so hungry, they will turn their hand to anything, was Daddy Hill. Daddy Hill was one of the principal generals who really comes to the fore at the early stages and becomes Wellington's right hand. And he's sent with a small unit back to Lisbon, and Wellington has just beat them there, unfortunately, before the retreat started. And that kind of picks us up, I think, into the next slide. So there are not many maps of this era for this detail, at least for this presentation. Bear with me as I put something together on Google. So this brings us to May 1809, the harsh winter. About this time, basically, is the retreat to Corunna. If you can picture it, Sir John Moore marched on Christmas Eve, and the battle at Corunna itself hasn't quite been fought yet. It'll be effectively next week. Wellesley lands in late May and has a really quick chance to reorganize. The British army that is there in Lisbon is actually preparing to load itself onto the boats to evacuate. They effectively have given up the fight. They hear that Sir John Moore has left and they're going to head back to Britain. There's talks of other expeditions and always South America and Central America, but Wellington, Wellesley knows that he needs to take the fight to the enemy. The situation is, especially in the north, near Marshal Ney's corps, there's a lot of guerrilla activity in the north of Spain. Just cut off from the screen, the Spanish army is in the south under Suesta, but they are massively dispersed. And Victor, with his corps just inside, is holding them down anyway. Up in the hills, in green is LLL, is the Loyal Lusitanian Legion. They're fighting a really effective screening battle. They're actually only probably in about brigade strength, so only about 2,000 plus men. But the French think they're about 3 times that number, and they're always trying to recruit locally to form from the Ordenanza, which is the the Portuguese militia. They're trying to recruit them into line battalions and train them up. And they're moving about so effectively in the hills that it's really distracting the French from their true strength, and they are basically scared of them. Wellesley then needs to make a decision. Does he move to support the Loyal Lusitanian Legion? But they won't give much reinforcements overall as they're so scattered. And he'll be striking straight into Salamanca, which is where Sir John Moore went wrong, leaving both his flanks exposed. He could march east to face Victor, who's actually slightly further away normally, but actually over very difficult terrain, over the mountains and into Spain. But he knows the support isn't going to come from Spain, even though they are promising and begging him. It's very unlikely, and it's a problem we see many times, that the Spanish promise a lot and deliver not enough. Whereas Soult is to his north. Soult is occupying the city of Porto, and he's sacked it. He sent a division under Loisan off to the east, a general that Soult doesn't trust, but a very capable general. So he sent him off on a separate mission, slightly dividing his strength. Porto was sacked not long before, in early May, and with terrible casualties. As it's the second city of Portugal, the Portuguese defended it mostly with their ordinanza, their militias, some of which didn't have proper weaponry, just farming tools, and formed lines outside the city. And it was actually, the army was led by the Bishop of Porto. Soult managed to push through these lines very easily and then sack the city, causing somewhere around 7,000 casualties, the majority of which will then be civilian. And then he takes to sacking the city. Wellesley knows this. He knows that the French army is laden down with their loot, and it would possibly be the safest option. But also, it gives the option of solidifying Portugal as one and pushing the French out of Portugal, which is effectively his aim at this time. The wider Peninsular War hasn't really taken place. It's concentrated in the west, and he really needs to solidify himself around his home ports. Otherwise, he's going to be defending Lisbon, which is a city with no defensive walls, and he's going to be on the back foot. So he goes on the attack. Next slide, please, Tom. Just a backward of Soult. Soult is a highly capable general. He's one of these French marshals who joins the French army, one of the local regiments, and is quickly promoted to sergeant, then elected to captain before becoming general. He is known as the Duke of Dalmatia, but he has his own aims in Portugal. And one of the hardest parts of the research to quite unpick is actually finding out what his motivation was in 1809. But there is a theory, a conspiracy, that he's wanting to crown himself as the king of Portugal. The real king of Portugal has escaped to Brazil during the invasion with all of the court and most of their gold and silver, which was one of the motivations to invade them anyway, was to loot the country. And he's in a good position to crown himself. Now, it's very commonplace, as I mentioned earlier, for Napoleon to hand out these kind of awards to his closest circle. But there's actually a conspiracy within his own army, led by actually some junior captains who are trying to negotiate with most of the French army to actually unseat him. And they actually go to Wellesley, who wisely meets them outside of his own camp so they don't see his own strength. And they go to him to ask to remove Soult and march against him. And it's a really complicated conspiracy where the French are conspiring against the French, and Wellesley's not sure whether to trust them. But Soult is there. Soult is one of Napoleon's most capable marshals. He has a very good record. He's risen up all the way through the ranks and nearly always in combat positions. But he is guilty of the worst crimes in the peninsula of the looting and pillaging, murdering, and he's engaging in that in Porto in buckets full, trying to fill his own pockets. We do see him continue it later on. It's really a trait that is quite hard to read about, some of these accounts, the sheer scale of devastation in Portugal. But Soult's a military commander who's kind of looking for the country life, possibly. I think next slide will show us our route. Again, Google Maps, because unfortunately the 1800 maps are basically sketches. And that's the route he takes. Not the most direct coastal road for Wellesley. He goes via Coimbra. He sends one army flanking west under Hill and one army flanking east under Beresford. Beresford has been appointed as commander of the Portuguese forces, as Wellesley's basically got too much on his hands to see them as well. So under the administration of Beresford, who's given a local rank, Portuguese rank, of Field Marshal. There's a lot of chatter in the British ranks about this. They're quite jealous that he's promoted above them. But Wellesley always reassures the British that it's a local Portuguese rank, and the British rank kind of comes through as being the most senior anyway. Beresford leads a very capable force. After all that distraction and Wi-Fi, I don't know if I'm going to have a quick sip of water. I don't know if there's any questions, Chris.
Hi, thank you. So first off, I just want to say we're up over 50 people watching us live right now. So thank you to everybody that rejoined us. I really appreciate your patience and glad you're still here. So really, Marcus, I'm going to take a quick look again, but the first question I saw comes from quite a few minutes ago when you were talking about the illness that was sort of devastating, and you talked about it in both armies. And so somebody was asking, what is the most common illness, or what were some of the common diseases that would have been striking down these armies at this time?
It's a difficult one because many of them, they changed their names from then to now. You're going actually mostly, the biggest one is going to be a case of basically pure exhaustion. The rations are slowly coming through. The British have got quite a good system of logistics. Wellington's taken over to what known as trains of wagon corps, I think the Royal Irish Wagon Corps at this time, and they are going to be providing logistics over this time. This is where it goes wrong around Corunna, but basically the men start to starve. And I know from, I don't know who's watching, but Zach's research, the men do turn to looting, even though the official policy is to pay for it where possible. The Spanish have no such stipulations about paying for it and treating them as allies. They turn the Spanish and the Portuguese into enemies. So they're trying to steal everything they can, which forces the population to hide it from them. And they will basically hide and bury literally underneath their villages their grain and their supplies. So the men are basically tracking down with exhaustion, but also exposure. They're being issued with a blanket, maybe a greatcoat, but not a lot else other than they can source themselves. Very few are actually going to be sleeping in tents. And so outside in, especially the winter, they're freezing at night and then baking in the summer in woolen uniforms and covering a huge amount of distances as well. So it's a combination of the food, the lack thereof, and then the exposure, and then anything else thrown in, especially waterborne diseases. The waters there is going to be really bad. And even little things. One of my research for the cavalry is they found that if you unload the horses straight into Spain and Portugal, and they give them local feed, even just local grass, the horses would unfortunately drop sick or drop dead very quickly. And you'd have to wean even the horses onto local grasses, like a ratio. They did a quarter, then a half, and then 3/4, mixing the British feed they're taking with them. So it's just that kind of difference. We're in a very, very apt for now, but we're in a pre-vaccine age. So they have exposures to different people and different cultures, and they are taking quite common illnesses with them or exposed to them. For one of the most common examples was that posting to the Caribbean Isles were often nicknamed the Fever Isles, and it was thought of as being effectively a suicide posting, with half the men would basically dropping down with a form of fever. And there was also malaria in this time as well, though not so much in Portugal, but certain areas of Spain.
All right, thank you. There's I don't see any other questions. There's an interesting discussion on sort of forms of artillery and how howitzers work in the chat.
Excellent.
But I don't see any other questions at this time. So I will just remind people quickly. Please, if you've got questions for Marcus, feel free to put them in the chat, or you're welcome to email them directly to me if you'd rather, and I'll get them to him at the next break. Thank you.
Thanks, and thanks again to everyone listening. They're sticking with us with a terrible technology. So we're going north. Yes, it's just cut off the bottom. The Anglo-Portuguese army in May 1809. Wellesley's got the main column, as I was mentioning. And most of these numbers I'm taking directly from Oman's work, who's the most reliable overall. And I normally balance them off because a few more sources in case anyone's wondering, including Ian Fletcher's work normally as well, and Fortescue. But he's got the main column of 17,378, which is particularly precise, and he's going up the Corunna road towards Porto. Beresford, as I said, he's taking eastern flank of 6,000 men, and he goes on a very wide northeastern manoeuvre, bypassing Porto. And then he leaves 12,000 men under Mackenzie in Lisbon, who was the previous commander who was trying to embark. And that's basically his reserve to make sure that the city is held. And there's also a degree within that of Portuguese forces that he's trying to train up new. Beresford has also got the majority of his men are actually Portuguese. I only think about 1,500 of them are British. So as the Portuguese field marshal, he's taking a Portuguese force. On Wellesley's march, he actually reorganises his army and spreads the Portuguese out, as they're unsure about how tried and tested they are, but they certainly prove themselves. I think the next slide breaks this down a bit more. So this is Wellesley's main column, and as you can see, it's divided into 3 main divisions under Paget, Hill, and Sherbrooke, and then it has the cavalry under Stapleton, Cotton. Not very many artillery on the bottom right-hand side, only 4 batteries, 24 guns. The cavalry, mostly formed of the 14th Light Dragoons, only 2 squadrons of them, so that's 4 troops. Some of the 16th Light Dragoons, the 20th Light Dragoons, and the 3rd King's German Legion, that's KGL. And as you can see there, different units organised. British regiments nearly always in this time are known by their numbers, and a few of them are the 2nd battalions of their regiments. Now, a wide stereotype, the 2nd battalion that Wellesley is kind of relying upon here for many of his regiments are often thought of as being inferior. The 1st battalion's fighting overseas and the 2nd battalion's recruiting. But Wellesley has to really rely upon these second battalions, and you can see the integrated Portuguese there. Just once, I think the next, if you click again, Tom, it will underline some different units there to talk about. So you can see at the top under Paget's, the 1st Battalion Detachment, and on the right-hand side under Sherbrooke's division, the 2nd Battalion of Detachments. And these are really interesting units, very short-lived, and made up of the survivors, effectively, of the retreat to Corunna. And I've got a separate slide to come on to them. And then underneath Hill's division, he's directly commanding the 1st Brigade, which is made up of 3 regiments and 1 independent company of the 5th 60th Rifles. So that gives an overview of how many units there were at the battle. And I'm going to focus in now, please, Tom, on Hill's Brigade. Hill's Brigade, which he's personally leading himself, there he is at the bottom, known as Daddy Hill, a man that the more you read about, the more I kind of admire him. He comes from a huge Shropshire family. I think he was one of 13 surviving children. I think his parents had 16 children. They were mostly pastors and preachers. His uncle holds minor aristocracy rank, but he's thought was actually being a kind of the child that wouldn't fight at school, wouldn't get rough and tumble. He was destined for law until he actually kind of asked his uncle to purchase him a commission. And he goes on and becomes friends with people like Beresford very early on. He's very well liked by his men, hence his nickname Daddy Hill. He's thought of as being the dad to everybody. And he only swears twice, once of which is when he's surrounded in the Pyrenees and is cut off in a flood. The French come to attack him. And I think even Wellington goes, "Oh, Hill, so you swore." He's very mild-mannered, doesn't really drink, doesn't really smoke, and is the dad to his men. And this is his brigade that he's personally leading. 3rd Regiment, the Buffs, the Royal West Kents. So in my neck of the woods, where I'm currently speaking to you from, if the Wi-Fi holds, and that's the picture of a reenactor we've got for Waterloo. Chris and Tom are there. This is one of the portraits that was done of the Buffs that feature very strongly. That reenactment group, incidentally, hopefully some of them might even be watching. They've provided some images for later on. You've got the 2nd 48th Northamptonshire and the 2nd 66th Berkshire Regiment. I like to include the county names, so they're not always named as that all the time. Just give a bit of flavour of Northamptonshire and Berkshire and where they come from, because they try to recruit locally. And those are the battalions that he's going to be personally leading, and they really come to the forefront of this story, along with 1 company of the 5th 60th Royal American Rifles, predominantly German. There's certainly a lot of different nationalities mixed in there for a light infantry regiment armed with the Baker rifles, and they're much less talked about. And he might be watching later, but Rod Griffiths has written a very good book telling a lot more stories about them, which I recommend, because they're not as well known as the 95th Rifles because of Sean Bean and Richard Sharp, but they do pop up in Sharp's company, and Sharp's enemy is Fredrickson's. But they have a lot to gain, and in fact they've been spread out company by company over brigades. It means that Wellesley's kind of known that he's going to be spreading out his strengths and using his light infantry a lot more than just his line regiments when it's going to be coming to this campaign, hence his reorganization to spread out both the Portuguese and the Royal American Rifles. So they're not fighting as a single battalion, but spreading the companies out. So their skills, their expertise, and their abilities are going to be needed and used. Next slide, please. So the 1st and 2nd Battalion detachments, they don't pop up in many history books. They effectively only have a very short existence. And the only time that anyone really has heard of them, apart from this short campaign, is it's the reference for Bernard Cornwell's South Essex Regiment that Wellington, as it was, David Troughton in that episode of Sharp's Eagle says, "I'm going to make you a battalion of detachments to fetch and carry." Now, they're not fetching and carrying. They are the survivors of Corunna, those who haven't managed to get north and have managed to struggle all the way from North Spain to southern Portugal, which is incredibly, hundreds of miles. It's an incredibly long distance, are being reformed, those not too sick. And they're actually so strong by this point that they've been formed into 2 battalions. If their regiment had been sent back to Portugal, they would be reissued with them. But the idea being that there's so many men, they couldn't have them all just kind of languishing in depot. These are fighting men with experience, and Wellington's going to use that in a very unorthodox way. The British regimental system is particularly strict normally, And this is him really going against this. So I've managed to get the figures for these units for part of my research I want to use. So next slides will show their strengths, please. So the 1st Battalion there, you can see it's 58 NCO, 777 men. Their commanding officer is actually a major acting lieutenant colonel from the 3rd Regiment, the Buffs, from Hills Brigade, and everyone else is really mixed in. This is predominantly got a lot of Highlanders in there, from the 42nd, 79th, 71st, and 92nd Highlanders. There's all sorts of other regiments that have now left Portugal and Spain entirely, like the 52nd is very strong, light infantry. This is quite Highland light infantry. And people have actually said to me, were there any 95th Rifles at Porto? And, you know, on paper, there's not. There's the 60th Rifles, but there's none of the 95th, except for the 1st Battalion detachments on strength have 35 rifles, and they actually fought as a separate company under the command of a light infantry officer. So there are some of the 95th there as well. So a real mixed bag. I'll send some of the links out later, or allow people to watch it back. I don't expect everyone to read long tables, but the next slide shows you the distribution of the 2nd Battalion. Again, some Highlanders and all sorts of different regiments really mixed in. Some there, just, you know, one member of staff from the 42nd Highlanders, but 96 in the 2nd Foot Regiment. So it gives a real flavour. This is a real ragtag bag. You know, they're meant to be fighting at strength of around 100 men into a company. The 2nd Battalion has kind of got there, but from all different regiments, different cohesions. Certainly, some of the Highland regiments, you know, were known to actually speak Gaelic, certainly, and some of the Irish regiments were certainly known to speak in their native tongue very frequently. So there are going to be a lot of different drills and procedures going on, and they're not going to have that form cohesion of your regiments that are used to living and talking together. If we can go on though, Tom, just want to give a flavour of them. So Wellington starts marching north. Hill takes the coast road, and they actually have to use boats to cross large lagoons. They catch the French almost completely by surprise and capture both French prisoners and cause some fighting. It's incredibly quick, seeing that in fact he's arrived back in late April to be forming here, but by the 10th of May, he's at Grijó. I hope my pronunciation here is right, which is only about 8 miles south of the heart of Porto. Here, it's actually the 1st Battalion detachments, which is why I mentioned them, go forwards. There's very few details of this battle. I know Stapleton Cotton took the cavalry on the right flank, and about 4 companies of light infantry from various regiments go forwards, and companies of light infantry from the 1st Battalion detachments. They fight the French back very rapidly, so much so that the French actually don't manage to break camp, and some of the British regiments take both the French food, and some of them even sleep in the French tents that evening, which is being thought of as a real luxury to the British men. There's an account where one of the British officers walks through the camp and talks of the luxuries that he's going to enjoy just for one night under canvas, which is the 10th of May. But Grijó, so Wellington's already on the attack and very near Porto before he falls upon the French with surprise. And this is meant to be Soult's outlying force to blockade and warn him, but they're completely overrun by the vanguard of Wellington's army. Next slide, please. Doesn't come across as well, but this is the approach into the city. To the west-hand side is Coimbra, which is where they've marched from, and they're moving up through to Vila Nova, which is the south of the city, the orientation of it. So the north is going to your right-hand side there. But I'll move on. Sorry, Tom. Okay. So taken from Captain George Wood's A Subaltern Soldier here. As we approached nearer the banks of the Douro, every step brought us into scenes more horrid. The enemy's advanced posts in these parts left numerous marks on their ravages and traces of their skirmishing. We now began to see the dying and the dead. Some of these have been mangled into a manner too shocking to be described by the Portuguese peasants, and out of revenge for brutal treatment previously experienced from them. We now passed clusters of inhabitants hanging mutilated from one tree, and on the next many French were suspended, all hacked and gored in the same manner, by way of retaliation. Such was the animosity between these inveterate foes. The priests were busily employed in taking down the unfortunate countrymen, praying for them and burying them. So as they start to see their opportunity to be liberated from the French, the Portuguese start to take their revenge. In other passages from that book, he finds trees full of dead priests as well. And in my other readings, I won't go into the full details of the horrors of this war, but they do account for the French offering the local Portuguese the choice of whether they're going to desecrate the churches or the women. And the Portuguese choose the church, and the French say, in revenge, we're going to desecrate both. So it's a really horrible war that they're approaching. And the British don't really realize this when they're down in Lisbon, but the scenes that's going to be shocking them when they go into Porto. They're not really prepared for this kind of warfare. Even the experienced soldiers who've been fighting in either India or Europe, suddenly having these scenes where the French are doing such horrendous things that they can't describe them. And then the Portuguese civilians, it says there that he knows that the Portuguese women are doing this to the French soldiers back as they're trying to go back through. It's thought of as being almost a death sentence to be a French soldier, fall behind the ranks of your friends because of what the Portuguese peasants will basically do to you. So it's going to be quite shocking for everyone involved. Next slide, please, Tom. It brings us on to Porto, a city I kind of hoped to be in about this time of the year, if everything hadn't changed. As you can see, it is a beautiful, beautiful city, all the matching tiles, and many bridges now, which weren't there at the time. Where this scene is of the nearest bridge is roughly in 1809, a pontoon bridge. Soult receives word that the British are moving in upon him, and he destroys this pontoon bridge. It was a series of barges with planks laid across them, but quite wide. So that is the River Douro, you see, and it's a great source of commerce. Soult destroys the pontoon bridges and orders that the Portuguese move all their barges onto the north banks, where he tries to have as many of them possibly destroyed. This is a really strict kind of curfew he puts upon the Portuguese civilians. Unsurprisingly, the Portuguese, who rely upon their barges and their boats as their source of commerce, mostly being involved in the wine trade, try to not either pretend they don't understand or to try to not comply with the French orders and hide their boats where possible, which becomes a really important part of this. But the pontoon bridge is destroyed, which means, on paper at least, there is no way for the British and Portuguese forces advancing from the south to cross that wide river. They move into the suburb of Vila Nova, which is on the far right-hand side, and Wellington manages to take up his position. If you click the mouse on, in a monastery on the heights there with the red arrow, and he takes on that position. The British are spotted, but the French kind of dismiss them as possibly being Swiss. Some of the French-Swiss regiments fight in red, and it's a really strange incident where they've got the intelligence that the British are there, and it's dismissed. Soult basically goes back to bed in the morning and ignores all the reports. Next slide, please, Tom. Again, Google Maps is the best source for this because the number of sketches. But the monastery where the red map was is where the Google pin is on the bottom left-hand side. And that brings us where the city looks like today. And that's the position. You've got the heights on the south and the majority of the city on the other side of a really wide river that's far too wide to possibly swim. The first major bridge built across in the modern era that survives, that's no longer used, is actually by Monsieur Eiffel, which is one of the ones there, of Eiffel Tower fame. Next slide, please, Tom, should show us the views. Oh, no, there's Porto in the mid-1800s with the wine barges, and you can see the monastery on the top right-hand side where the British positions were and how busy the quayside was back in the 1800s with their wine barges. I think actually that the river was possibly even wider than it is today, and today it's been built up a bit further towards the banks where they built roads, but there weren't any roads directly across there. It's not a particularly fast flowing river, but it is wide enough, and you can actually, it's difficult with the quality, but there was a pontoon bridge in this painting in the background. There was no opportunity to grab a skin, a float and swim across. It would exhaust anybody trying it, especially with their packs and their weapons. Okay, next slide. And these are two views, again, taken off Google, which is the best source that we can do for some of these at the time. And this is looking across pretty much from where Wellington would have been in the monastery on the south bank, looking across. You've obviously got to ignore Eiffel Tower, Monsieur Eiffel's Eiffel Tower style bridge spanned in iron and going across. But if you ignore that and you ignore the road along the river, not too much has changed. And he sees an opportunity. Wellington, given any of his flaws, which I will admit he has some, even as somebody who fiercely defends Wellington, he has an incredible eye for the ground. He's really developed this in India. Many years campaigning, 9 years in campaigning in India. He can spot what kind of small rise in a hill he can defend, or even a small dead ground that he can hide men in. And he sees an opportunity in the buildings, which, if you give the mouse a click for me, please, Tom, or highlight a seminary. It's pretty much one of the highest points of the city, and it's also been left undefended. And this is where he's going to push his efforts towards. Next slide will give us a better view of it from the riverside, I think. And if you click again, we get the arrow. So that you're down here almost at water level. You can see it's not going to be an easy climb in any way, shape or form. And actually how daunting that river is with a cliff face above, directly towards the positions. But this is the path that Wellington chooses. He assembles his men towards him. He brings many of his guns up forwards, and then dispatches the King's German Legion under General Murray, off to the east, upriver, basically. So there's a flanking force within this that go upriver. He actually starts to move some of his units under the Brigade of Guards, which he had, slightly further into the city, where there's destroyed pontoon bridges. But this is where his focus is going to be upon here. I think the next slide will bring us on to, this is where they're going to be climbing. But next slide though, please. So I mentioned earlier that there was a Captain Waters who brought the intelligence to Sir John Moore. And this is the only painting I can find of him at the moment. And this is him in later life. He ends up as a general, passes away in London, and is buried in Kensal Green Cemetery, for anyone who knows London, whereas most of the who's who of Napoleonic history are buried, actually, including a descendant of Napoleon. And he's now actually a local colonel. He's been promoted from captain to a British major, but he's now a lieutenant colonel in the Portuguese army. And he's one of Wellington's famous exploring officers. These are basically intelligence officers that go off into the countryside in their uniforms, so they cannot ever be shot as a spy. And he speaks the languages. He speaks Spanish and Portuguese. And he goes along the rivers, and he manages to find a local barber who has a skiff, so a very small barge that he can stand on. And the barber very excitingly explains to Colonel Waters in Portuguese, who understands what he's saying, that there are more barges hidden on the north bank in the reeds. And Waters, the barber, and a local friar, whose history doesn't record the name of the barber or the friar, go across and take these barges and bring them back to Wellington. So Colonel Waters pops up quite a few times, and there's not much on him in history. He has a really important role of saying, so now Wellington's got Colonel Waters in front of him, a Portuguese friar, a barber, a few other locals, and 3 long wine barges. Next slide, please, Tom. These are the wine barges, not far from the Seminary crossing point. Still used today, beautiful vessels, and you can see the wine barrels of port laid out along the middle there. They're carried and they can be rolled forwards and aft along the Douro. Very practical. Not a lot's changed in the 200 years, but they can be either punted along road, or they do have sails. If you click again for me, Tom. And they do these processions with the ports companies down. There's Taylor's Ports, and you'll find pretty much every ports company you know, Taylor's, Graham's, and many others that are known for their good ports, their fortified wine, are there, and they've got their own barges, and they will do these processions. But in 1809, they were a very practical vessel, hence they were refusing basically to destroy them. But everything the Portuguese could do to kick the now hated French out of their country, they were willing to help them. So you've got 3 of these vessels at Wellington's feet, effectively. Next slide, please, Tom. Now, Wellington is known for being a micromanager. He really, really was a man to manage every fine detail. Famously at Waterloo, riding around, finding everywhere he can. We've got copies at Apsley Wellington Arch of the orders that he wrote about the defence of La Haye-Saint and Hougoumont and the burning barns, and he'd even order who was going to be sleeping in the orchard that night. At Salamanca, he crosses the battlefield just to give orders to his brother-in-law, Ned Paget, and then rides back himself, not wanting his aide-de-camp doing it. And it was really strange that he actually kind of gives one of his most laconic orders that I can ever think of for anybody. Hill reassures Wellington that the Buffs are there on the foreshore with the rest of his brigade of the Northamptonshire and Berkshire regiments behind them, and they're ready to cross with these barges, these 3 barges. And Wellington just kind of laconically waves his hand and says, "Let them cross," which is the quote I've put in there. He's saying he's ready for them to go. And 2 companies of the Buffs get ready, but the first one, led by a lieutenant and 25 men, get into those barges. Before I describe the next portion, this brings us up to about 11 o'clock in the morning of the battle. Just wondering if there's any quick questions about this stages, Chris, whilst I have a sip.
I'm just taking a quick look, and I don't really see any questions, but a few comments for you. A couple of my favorites are, one is we are all on post-Christmas diets, so if you could stop talking about wine anytime, that would be appreciated by some of our audience.
I'm afraid that's not going to happen.
And then another one, if anybody is organizing trips to Portugal or Porto, I think you've got just about a plane full when we're allowed to travel again. Based on this audience alone, I think you're doing a great job of cellaring the Portuguese tourism with your pictures. So
it's one of the reasons that I love this battle, because when we're all post-COVID, I'm going to go out there and walk around a battlefield that about every 200 meters is a wine cave where you can do tasting samples. So I think it's going to be a really tough one to do.
I think there will be lots of people who will be joining you. So, and then somehow you've managed to offend the entire county of Kent, because the 50th Regiment was East Kent, but you mentioned West Kent. So I think you owe Kent County an apology, please.
I forgot Kent.
That was the comment. This is not from my area of expertise, but the comment was, you said the 50th Regiment was West Kent.
Did I say West Kent? And I meant East Kent.
I think so.
That's because I live in Kent and I'm getting it wrong, so I'm offending even myself now. So apologies for that one.
So I'm just looking now, and we've got another question popping up. Would cavalrymen jump straight onto a new mount, or would they somehow familiarize themselves with that horse?
So in theory, they would be familiarizing themselves. But if they are doing a remount, a necessity would be that they would be jumping pretty much straight onto those. They would be trying to buy them locally, because it was effectively one trooper, one soldier to a mount. So they didn't really have spares. The officers would often buy spares, so they would have that luxury effectively, but they're buying that out of their own pocket. But out there on campaign, if something happened to their horse, they would be jumping straight onto that remount effectively. Something that's very interesting is it's not long before this kind of era that the Royal Veterinary College is founded in London, and each of the cavalry regiments is assigned a trained vet, which is really forward thinking. Actually, it's the welfare of the animals. But they had farriers And farriers, if anyone knows their equestrian, aren't there just to put on horseshoes and do blacksmithing. They're there also for horse welfare. And it's something that really comes to the forefront, is the welfare of the horses. And not, I mean, I guess it's a little bit mercenary almost, that they're not doing it just because they like their horses. But it's obviously that the more that they can look after these horses, the more that they will get out of them. And if anybody wants to basically have a very sad afternoon, if you read the beginning of Mark Urban's book on Scoville, the code breaker, he opens with the end of the loading of the horses at the retreat to Corunna, where they're nearly all shot by their troopers, and it's just absolutely heartbreaking. So I think the men form such a close bond with their mounts, you know, kind of one and the same for the cavalry. So no, if they were buying them locally because they're short of horses, they would be jumping straight on them. There was an additional problem that they normally had less horses than they did men, so they would often have lots of men dismounted in the cavalry. So any horses they could really get their hands on that were suitable, they would. The horses were only about 15.5 hands to 14.5 hands. They were quite small, just off a pony today, really. They're not big horses, actually, for most of the British cavalry at the time. That's if anyone knows horses.
Yeah. So interesting. So I'm going to keep monitoring the chat, but I think we're caught up now. But I'm sure, as I say, if you've got more questions, please feel free to post them, and we'll get them at our next break.
Thanks, Chris. So we're getting to the crossing now, the crossing of the Douro that we've come to. Wellington says, let them cross, and they start to begin. So Tom, take us on. And this is their position, a hand-drawn map that they take. You can see General Murray's force to the east. They actually managed to stumble across more boats as well. And it's during this time that more boats start to come out of the city as well for the guards, effectively. But the real concentration is going to be with the buffs, the East Kents, going across initially. So it's one officer and 25 men in the first barge. Next photo. So there's reenactors from the buffs. Very kindly, these buffs Living History Society provided these from the reenactment, I think in 2009, the bicentenary of this. And you can see the reenactors, I think they had a fantastic time in recreating this crossing for doing some waterborne activities. And straight on to the next one, please, Tom. Yes, they're smiling far too much here to be soldiers, but this is the reenactors, and it's pretty much like for like. They're in the actual barges. The design hasn't changed. You can see they're in the buff uniforms with the light company plumes. So you've got one officer and 25 men in the first barge. I know then that all of the light company cross in the next barges, and under them there's then another company of the buffs under a very confusingly named Major Wellington. So nothing to do with the Duke of Wellington or Wellesley, but just to really confuse my research, there is a Major Wellington in this battle. And those are the first two companies that get across. They go up those steep cliffs to the Seminary. Next slide, please, Tom. And you can see the seminary there in the distance. They managed to get into that seminary without anyone discovering them. It's just cut off the watermark, so I really want to shout out to Krista Hook, and she's very kindly provided this and a later image in high quality from her book, far in advance, that she did for the Rifles charity a couple of years ago, which is a brilliant book full of illustrations. But as it's cut off the watermark, I just want to mention very kindly that I've got it behind her. Krista Hook, her paintings, brilliant, of the Peninsular War and Napoleonic era. So you can see there the buffs loading in, with the barges taking them across, and enthusiastic Portuguese helping everybody into their forces. So that's what we have. You can see the steepness, hopefully, in the background of the position. And this is the position that the British are trying to defend, but they've got to actually get up that really steep slope, carrying their packs, carrying their weapons and their ammunition and everything they can with them. A soldier literally has to carry everything his entire life on his back. and get into that with some degree of stealth. Speed is key here, because establishing basically a beachhead on the other side is going to leave them incredibly vulnerable until they're inside those seminary walls. Lovely painting. Thanks, Tom. Next slide. And this is a seminary today. It's now a school. I think it's previously an orphanage. And so much of the outbuildings are actually now playing fields and sports grounds and being cut off. But this is taken from Google Street View. But looking straight up, you can see the imposing nature of this building. And filtering in all the time across those back slopes are the buffs. And when they manage to get through, it'll be the rest of Hill's brigade. And this is where it gets very difficult, but also very interesting for me doing the research, is in what order they crossed. And I know from Wood's first-hand accounts as Subaltern soldier that the Light Company and Major Wellington's company were the first two in. There's now then conflicting stories about whether the Light Company of the Berkshires and the Northamptonshires are in basically the third wave, or whether it's all of the buffs. Wellington writes later that it's all the buffs first, and that there's 1,000 men of them, but there's also the individual regiments of the other parts of Hill's brigade claiming that they were there. We know from Wood's account that actually there was at least one rifleman from the 5th 60th who's got across, a German rifleman, as he's noted for basically sniping down French officers. But they managed to get into this position with some degree of stealth. They at least managed to get the first two full companies of the Light Company and Major Wellington's company of the Buffs in before the French spot them. The nearest French regiment, which is at least one battalion of the 17th regiment, normally the French regiments are formed into 3 battalions, just to slightly confuse matters, whereas the British normally in 2. At least one battalion launches an assault upon those first 2 companies in there. Next slide, please, Tom. And in that initial attack, the nearest commanding officer, General Paget, who is the younger brother of the famous General Paget of Waterloo fame, Uxbridge, Marquis of Anglesey, who loses his leg at Waterloo. General Edward Paget is actually shot moving up the shore. It's not many accounts of it, so I'd love to find more information about this part, but how somehow he's moving up the shore towards the seminary, and he's shot in the arm, and the arm is amputated that day. He does lose it. So that's one of the first casualties, really. And this starts the fighting. The next shot fired basically is from a British howitzer on the south bank. They see a French gun crew moving up into position, and these howitzers, I say, they lob their shells over. And you might have had some discussion on this. They fire the first shot for the British, and they actually fire upon the French gun, and every single man of that French gun crew is killed or wounded in one shot. So it's a very effective shooting from the Royal Artillery. They've managed to get their guns into position and wipe out an entire French gun in one shooting. And this really starts the attack. The 17th Beam are going in, and apart from General Paget, is relatively light casualties as they're within their stone walls. Next slide, please, Tom. And it picks us up then onto our main the main attack. So they're pushed back once. At some point during this, at least effectively all of the buffs, but it's going to start getting really mixed in between the buffs, the 48th and the 66 are all within this seminary walls. Wellington writes that there's 1,000 men within this building, and they managed to take up positions at all different angles. Again, another excellent painting by Christopher Hook of showing them actually like leaning out the windows and repulsing. The British do move at least one company down the road, and then they see now full 3 battalions of the 70th French regiment marching upon them with guns in support, so French artillery in support, marching upon them, and they withdraw back to the courtyard and the main building of the seminary and effectively take rapid fire. I think this is where Bernard Cornwell basically has Sharp like kind of teleport into the battle, confusingly, just to help everybody. But this is where they appear, and they're firing back from the windows. There's not really much need to make loopholes in the building of this. This is a really strong stone building, and they take basically pot shots and start repulsing the French. Next slide will give me, I think, the yeah. So these are the positions that they come across, and you can see how many of the guns. So Wellington's only got about 24 guns, and he moves most of them onto that south bank, and to give him crossfire. So you can see, again, sorry, apologies for the maps, but you can see here the 17th EAM Leger, so their regiments moving in, the 70th in behind, but how many of the British guns are able to defend upon that position? Meanwhile, the 29th, the Coldstream Guards and the 3rd Guards, as they're then called, managed to find enough boats on the bottom left-hand side to basically cover the pontoon bridge, whilst General Murray goes upon the far, far right with the King's German Legion, hence they're covered in yellow for whoever's done this. But King's German Legion are effectively German soldiers in British uniform as part of the British Army, so they're the same. And they start to get engaged. Now, under Murray, the French cavalry start to engage. Soult's main army were actually drawn up that morning into withdrawing from the city along with their loot. And they see no reason to stop this. So even though the British are now on the north bank, they continue to move on the north road out of the city. The French cavalry decide to cover this and attack Murray, who's the most visible because he's outside of the city. And there's a strong cavalry exchange, mostly led by the 14th Light Dragoons, who've managed to get their horses and their men onto boats well upriver and start flanking back down towards the city. It's where Murray comes in for a lot of criticism, and no one knows why, but he's very nearby the cavalry exchange with units of the King's German Legion, and he orders them to rest basically on a hill overlooking the position. It's a strong position, which is the only defense that I can really think of for him, that he's held this slight hill and doesn't want to leave it. But if he charged forwards, a lot of people would say they actually would have captured the French cavalry with superior numbers. But unfortunately, they don't do so. And under General Stuart, who goes on, he has one of the most beautiful portraits, General Stuart, of the whole era. It's really just dripping with gaudiness. And he leads a charge and cuts off a lot of the French cavalry. Meanwhile, led by the 29th Foot and then the Guards, they start to march through the city, not reaching too much defense, opposition. The French fight a fighting retreat through the city. So rapid are their retreats that the British almost actually fire upon themselves as they're coming off different roads. They keep expecting to have firing with the French, and they come upon different regiments of their own, and they turn and present. And it's only by very quick thinking of some senior officers that they present some blue on blue scenarios. Should bring us on. One more slide, please, Tom. Oh, I've sent you my old one. That's fine. Next slide, and I'll tell you what that quote was going to be. Because that slide was going to be, I've sent you my unsaved account, which is fine because that quote was from another officer that I found, and he was actually within the walls of the seminary. And he says that he manages to cross over, and the light company of the buffs go forwards. Meanwhile, one of the women of the seminary, so I presume like a kind of servant lady living there, she comes out and gives him wine and cake, and he kind of picnics in the grounds as the first fighting goes on. And as he hears the fighting get closer, he grabs all of his company, which I presume is Major Wellington's company, and they go out, assist the light company, and fighting withdrawal within inside. And it's him who notes that there's a German rifleman within the unit who starts fighting back and sniping down French officers. Apologies for that. I had that as a nice quote. And the French then quit the city. Once the 70th, the second attack is defeated, they basically turn tail and try to quit the city as quickly as possible. Soult's too interested in trying to take as much of his wagons as possible, and so they go. And I'll quickly go into the what happens next under Soult and retreat. But to kind of summarize these losses, these strong walls that the French attack leads to relatively light British losses. The British lose 121 men killed and wounded, including 2 missing, which in this scenario probably means like a disaster in the river or something. 50 of those are from the buffs, these Kents. 17 of them were from the Northamptonshires, and 10 of the killed from the 2nd 66th. The rest of the killed and wounded that don't make up those numbers are from the cavalry, effectively, mostly the 14 light dragoons. Meanwhile, the French, it's a completely different story. For a battle, you know, these are incredibly low losses, almost closer to a skirmish, but not on the French side. They've had over 477 killed and wounded. That's because the 17th EAM have quite accurate records of 177, with the 70th EAM, who go in a full regimental attack of 3 battalions, they estimate 300. And it starts to go quickly into estimations here, which is the fog of history, and the more accuracy I can add flesh onto this, I will. There's a further 300 men, mostly from the 70th EAM, immediately captured. Wellington then goes into the city and finds Soult's hospitals, basically. And that includes another 1,200 to 1,500 plus casualties within the cities. 6 guns immediately. I know at least one of those are captured by the 66th, and a huge amount of the wagon train, mostly that is loot rather than supplies, that loot that belongs to the city. Next slide, please, Tom. And the aftermath of this. So in the aftermath, I mean, Generals became Subaltern Officer Woods goes in, and he starts wandering through the city, and he sees basically the bare walls. I'll just quickly read one more quote. He visits actually a house of one of his old friends who's living there, a Welsh friend of his. And he says, to witness the destruction occasioned in this beautiful residence was truly pitiable upon entering. I perceived the fine balustrades broken, the chandeliers and mirrors were shattered to pieces, and all the portable furniture had been taken away, and the remainder either wantonly burned or otherwise destroyed. The choice pictures were defaced, and the walls resembled the French barrack blocks more than the Portuguese house that it should be. Whilst he was here, he went to visit the Welsh gentleman who married a Portuguese lady who was a resident of this town, of whom I'd been billeted on our first landing here. He goes on to provide a most painful description when he met upon the stairs and received me with great kindness. He showed me into the parlour and pointing to an armchair, told me that in that seat, an officer, a French officer, and a few hours before, had blown out the brains of his poor old father-in-law because he not to resign to one of his daughters to gratify for his abominable lust for this detestable assassin, who he suspected was secreted in this house, though in reality she had fled to the mountains upon the first approach of the enemy. So Wellington's troops find Porto much as they feared, and it's basically been stripped bare, and murder is commonplace still after the fighting, and the French can do whatever they want. Into the hills, though, Soult's army marches. They've got a lot of distance to cover to actually get themselves back towards the nearest kind of safe grounds, towards Ney's Corps in Spain. And they've got to cover a huge amount of mountainous terrain and very slippery paths. The next day, on the 13th of June, it starts to rain, and it rains for the next 2 days solid. And these mountainous paths become incredibly sticky and slippery. During this time, Soult decides that to get up the terrain, he has to lose all of his cannons. And these are not only a weapon of war, it's always worth noting that though cannons can be one of the biggest causes of casualties, to gunners, I'm including myself here, your guns or your colours are your symbol of pride. And so for Soult to have turned around and say that they're going to destroy them, so they spike some of the guns, they put like a nail into the touch hole and push them down cliffs. Others, they noted that they're actually pointed towards each other, and they're both fired at the same time to blow up the barrel, so incredibly destructive. And he decides to do this to all of his cannons, not even just the heavy cannons, so he loses all of his guns. They also take the decision to all of their loot that they're carrying, and there is a substantial amount of silver and further, to throw these wagons down into ravines and to lose them. There are some quite actually fanciful stories that there might still be treasure hoards at the bottom of these ravines, but I wouldn't encourage anyone to go looking for them. I imagine that anyone passing by would have taken those a long time ago. And then men who fall by the wayside and who aren't killed by the killed by the Portuguese peasantry for their revenge are captured. Soult loses a further 4,500 men during this retreat over the mountains, with Wellington relatively close on his heels. Wellington has to halt for a full day and a half to reorganize himself. He doesn't manage to keep a full retreat on. During this time, actually, on the evening of the 12th of May of the main battle, he does actually write some of his famous dispatches. Wellington's a prolific letter writer. He writes to Beresford, who goes on to capture the town of Amarante and tell him that the city is being captured and to carry on basically harassing the French as best he can. He also writes, I think, the most surprising dispatch is he writes a dispatch to General Soult himself. And in this dispatch to Soult, he describes where the French have left their prisoners behind, but he basically admonishes Soult quite badly by saying that he hasn't left any medical staff behind, but only the wounded. So all of these wounded are already prisoners, and they've got no one to care for them. Wellington reassures Soult that he won't make their situation any worse, but he doesn't have spare medical staff to look after 500 plus French wounded, plus many more streaming in. And that he urges Soult to actually send medical staff back. And he says that actually once they've been treated, he will send the medical staff back to the French. This is under kind of a flag of truce, which is quite gentlemanly, I think. And he also then opens up a negotiations to do an exchange of prisoners, because now he kind of holds the upper card. He might be able to negotiate some of the British prisoners back. The French carry on. They have to cover dozens of smaller rivers during this time. And many of them are really interesting. Some of them are held by Portuguese ordinanza, the militia, and are almost blown up. Very hard to do. There's a series of skirmishes where the French force themselves across, mostly at the dead of night. I think there's a force of 100 French grenadiers at the middle of night shimmying across on timbers, for example. Very brave force of French to do this in the face. But then at the bridge of Alicante, which is this beautiful 1600s bridge, these arches, which is this painting here, it's being held by the Loyal Lusitanian Legion, who I mentioned earlier, along with 2 cannon. And after quite fierce fighting, and you can see a French sapper with his axe raised, they storm across it. The Loyal Lusitanian Legion try to withdraw back, and they've actually already set charges on the bridge, and they blow the charges to destroy the bridge, which does nothing really to it. It's so solid piece of engineering. The smoke clears, and the bridge is still standing, very heavily damaged. And the French now have the opportunity to storm across, and the Royal Lusitanian Legion have to abandon their 2 guns. It's this really interesting all arms corps. They abandon their guns and head to the hills. So the French actually do manage to have to fight their way back across. But Wellington then continues the pursuit. He waits for 2 days and then falls upon the French rearguard himself, and so that contributes further towards these 4,500 prisoners that are captured. He starts to reorganize, and very soon afterwards, he does enter Spain, and there's a whole separate thing there because that starts the Talavera campaign. So I will call it. I think that will be my last slide, please, Tom. Yes, that will finish there. There's so much more to carry on because it rolls forwards into Talavera, but any further and you start to encroach a whole separate battle, which is a massive campaign. So that is Porto. I just want to say thank you, and also firstly thanks to Tom and Chris for organising a brilliant series of talks. And I'm looking forward really to February especially, and the big symposium. But I welcome people. There's my little website with some blog articles, dukeofwellington.org. I've tried to not bore people on my personal Facebook, so I've taken to Twitter, where I interact with especially Tom and Chris and many people regularly at Cribb History. So I'm on there daily, too frequently probably on Twitter if anyone wants me, or my website's got contact details as well if anybody wants to email me. And I'm always open to talking about Duke of Wellington, especially, or Porto, or the Peninsular War, or anything related to that. Very, very welcome to. So thank you very much.
Why don't we clear a couple last questions? And Marcus, why don't you try turning your camera on so we have you for this part of it? Chris, is there any more questions there?
Yeah. So a few, Marcus, going back, you were talking about the cavalry in our last question exchange, and I just had one that I just missed before you started continuing. And the question was, what would happen to those cavalrymen that were dismounted that didn't have remounts, that there weren't horses available? Uh, would they be reassigned somehow? Would they just stay behind the lines? What would they do?
Yeah, I mean, they would stay behind. They would be given other duties, things like prisoner guarding or guarding of headquarters. Typically, they were armed with a carbine, so they would still be effective. But unlike French dragoons, especially in the era, who would dismount and fight in the hills, especially, and were quite adept at skirmishing, apart from picket duty, which is like sentry duty, the British didn't do that so much. So it was more behind the lines jobs at senior headquarters, guarding and similar tasks.
All right, thank you. And then you had spoken a lot about the British howitzers, but a few people asked if the French had similar howitzers as well.
The French had howitzers, but what they didn't have was shrapnel. So they had exploding shells, but they couldn't copy that shrapnel. It was basically top secret cutting edge technology. It's why it's so exciting. It had been developed by a Royal Engineer, depending on which time it is, Colonel Shrapnel, and it's getting the ratio right where the shell is stable enough to explode and fire effectively their musket balls in the first layer with an explosion in the middle. Because I've got a cannonball behind me. So you need to cross section it. The middle core, like if you imagine a diagram like the Earth's crust, you've got the crust of the iron, you've got the middle magma, but that outer layer, that sludge that we get, in volcanoes, that's the musket balls. And the French just haven't managed to develop that yet. So they've got exploding shells, which just explodes. I mean, this is a solid shot. It just explodes that, but you're losing a lot of the energy from the explosive core, the gunpowder. So there's not a lot. So you're going to be hit by large fragments. But if you think about it, the large fragments aren't going to hit many people. When they do, they'll cause damage, but they're not going to cause as many casualties, because what you want is lots of small pieces, which is the shrapnel, coming out. Shrapnel now becomes interchanged into any bit that breaks off. But back then, it was a really specific part, and it meant the musket balls inside that was going to go out and cause that damage. So it's cutting edge technology. It's something that an advantage, a step up that only the British really had.
Right, thank you. And then a quick question. Somebody asked, General Graham, was he involved in the battle in any way? The British General Graham?
General
Graham.
Not in that battle. No, if I get my dates right, Graham is in the south of Spain for most of the early campaign, and only joins later on after Cadiz is basically, I want to say freed, but it's not. He fortifies Cadiz and manages to push the French back. So that's after 1811. So no, Graham is in the south at this time. So yeah, he's another one that becomes Wellington's second in command. But at this time, it's Hill. And Hill's really the forefront figure for a lot of this. Graham is a fascinating character. There's a beautiful painting of him in Apsley House, but Graham brings his own regiment. He actually raises his own regiment, if anyone doesn't know, to fight the French. He actually loves France, but hates the French Revolution, that he pays to raise 2 battalions, the Peninsular Volunteers, to fight. It almost bankrupts him, but he does do this. So Graham's a fascinating one, but doesn't feature at Porto.
Thank you. Just a couple more. So you were talking about the prisoners and the sort of lack of medical supplies that Wellington, he was doing his best, but he didn't have the supplies. Did Soult ever send any supplies or medical men or anything?
Not immediately, because he's in full-blown retreat and he needs them himself. So at this stage, no, the French medical records for that are really slow. I do hope at some point to get into French archives with my limited schoolboy French. Would be quite interesting, but I will try my damnedest. I want to paint the whole story. But no, I don't believe they did. Wellington, I'm sure, would have given them the best he could have done, but you are talking 500 at least already sick with more streaming in. It would have been a huge task for any doctors. At the time, just to give a bit of context, most British regiments would have one major surgeon who would be a qualified doctor, and up to 2 assistant surgeons who might not necessarily be qualified doctors. I'm happy to be rectified on that, but yeah, so medical standards weren't great anyway, and that's to look after their own men. That's why Wellington says it, it almost feels like a bit of a tactic if Soult wasn't trying to take all of his loot with him to kind of slow down the British. So Wellington's trying to make sure they're provisioned for. But no, I don't really know their fates. I'm presuming they stayed in their hospital. It's quite likely, because Wellington does mention in that dispatch in detail that there's not many medical staff in Porto, which makes sense considering the fact they've been ransacked. I would imagine, and this is just a guess, that the church would do their best, so that the monks and the nunneries would probably try to take them in as charity. How much their morals versus their patriotism help them there, because they had brother monks killed in that retreat by the French, would have been interesting. But their fate isn't really recorded because many of the rank and file are illiterate, and the French wounded officers would largely have been taken away. So they're not really recorded as I found yet. I hope I would find something at some point. Yeah, good question. Good question.
Interesting. Thank you. A couple more quick ones, if that's all right. The seminary itself, somebody was asking about the strength of it. Would it, just the walls themselves, would they be able to stand up to artillery? Were they strong enough to withstand artillery if that was a factor?
I would have assumed that light artillery. They certainly weren't breached and heavily damaged during the fighting. The French brought up guns. So yes, it's an incredibly thick walled building. I don't know about the outer walls. It had a forecourt, which I said now is like tennis courts. But the French didn't manage. They brought up guns. They didn't manage to bring them up to much effect. They're bringing up through the streets, and the British had the covering fire. They had at least 3 batteries there, and were raining down it's called counter battery fire, where the guns fire against guns. I don't hear of any major ones. I mean, the British casualties alone being so light pushed me in the direction to say that they weren't breached if they were in range. It's not something that's heavily talked about. They talk about the French do bring up some guns from the north position, which are not covered by the Royal Artillery. However, given the fact that they didn't manage to breach the walls, no. So yeah, the walls probably were fine.
Right. Thank you.
I wouldn't want to stand there all day and test it and pound it, but yeah, they're probably okay.
And then I think the last one that I'm seeing right now, and just a quick reminder for people, if I've missed your question, please feel free to put it in the chat again. It's not intentional. Sometimes I miss them. But I've got a question about the composition of the French forces. Now, obviously, it changes throughout the Peninsular War, but at this battle specifically, were the French forces mostly French, or were they made up of a lot of different nationalities?
Mostly French, but with a strong amount of Swiss. Mostly, yeah. It does change. Normally, they are described as French, but they could be from all different nations. I haven't found anything that's wildly out. You've got Neapolitan troops sometimes and places like that. But no, there was definitely Swiss. That's hence the misunderstanding that they could have been Swiss. So there's at least one regiment, which again multiple battalions of Swiss there. Yeah, Swiss and French.
All right, thank you. I think Tom, I think that's all the questions I see. So I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, thank you for everyone joining us this afternoon and sticking with us. We had a little bit of a technology hiccup, but then that's part partly why we're doing the speaker series is to learn and then adapt, adjust our approach. And I think once we got reconnected, it flowed really well. So thank you so much, Marcus. Lots of great feedback I see in the chat. People really appreciate the information you shared and how you delivered it. Very well done. Once again, thank you everyone for joining us, and we look to see you again soon on one of our future talks. So I'm going to stop the screen right about here. So.